Business Diplomacy Today, the podcast about international relations and geopolitics from a business perspective. We help you anticipate the changing political and societal trends that influence your business.
Welcome. My name is Matthias Catón. I'm your host. Business Diplomacy Today is presented by the German Maritime Center. To find out more about the center, go to maritime.center. You can also find the link in the show notes. Our guest today is Dr Tevin Tafese, a development economist and research fellow at GIGA, the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, where he is at the Institute for African Affairs. GIGA is based in Hamburg, and he is part of the research program on globalization and development. Tevin's research focuses on economic development in the global south, especially in Africa. He works on trade, foreign direct investment, labor markets, and structural change. A growing part of his work explores how digital transformation and Africa's emerging technology sector are creating new opportunities, challenges, and lessons for employment and economic development on the continent. Beyond his academic research, Tevin contributes to evidence-based policy advice, and he regularly engages wider audiences through public speaking. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Göttingen in Germany. Tevin, welcome to Business Diplomacy Today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
My introduction of you also gave the topic away. We will talk about Africa today, but not just about the continent, specifically about business opportunities for international companies in the continent. To kick things off, Africa's combined economic output is projected, I believe, to reach approximately $3.3 trillion this year. Growth rates are around 4%, which is on a global scale quite healthy, I would say, certainly more than what we see here in Europe. So it is outpacing many advanced economies. East Africa alone is expected to grow at 5.8% this year. Meanwhile, Africa's population is set to double by 2050. That means 20 million new jobs are needed every single year. That's an amazing amount of jobs. Those are staggering numbers, and we want to talk about those. Tevin, when you hear about emerging markets, Africa is often seen as one block. However, I think there are 54 countries, if I'm not mistaken, on the continent, and they are extremely different economies, different sizes, different levels of development. How would you describe where Africa stands economically today, and what would you say are the most common misconceptions that European businesses, for example, have?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thanks again for having me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to share my research with you and my thoughts on these topics. Yeah, I think in general, you've already mentioned a few of the key indicators, right? So on the one hand, of course, we have the economy. You mentioned very strong growth rates in Africa, also by global comparison. I think there's a few caveats that one has to mention. On the one hand, this growth is coming from a comparatively low basis, right? And then on the other hand, per capita GDP is still much lower on average on the African continent. We can talk a bit more about that, maybe moving forward, about different regions, since, as you've also mentioned, Africa is a large continent, consists of a diverse set of countries, diverse set of regions that have different economic foci, right? So some economies focusing on minerals, some on agricultural outputs, some a bit more on manufacturing, but that not too much to say that already. So the economy is one aspect. And then you've mentioned the population boom in Africa. And I think this is the economy combined with the population acceleration. These two factors in combination, I think, make Africa such an interesting continent from many different perspectives. I think culturally also, right? I think we won't talk about that too much in this conversation, but especially also economically, right? Especially if we think about where much of the growth will come from in the future and where most of the demand will actually come from, right? So you've mentioned that by 2050, 2.5 billion people will live in Africa. By 2100, it will actually be, I think, 30-40% of the global population. And most importantly, a large share of the working age population will actually be living in Africa. And this has several implications for businesses. I mean, on the one hand, obviously, you need working age population to promote your economy. You need people who work. So much of the growth also in the future will most likely come from Africa. So we're just at the beginning, given that the median age in Africa is now around 20 years of age. Compare that to Germany, where we, I think, like, let's say 45 or something like that, right? Even in the future, Africa for a long time will be the continent with a large share of the working age population, and hence also the continent where much of the demand will actually come from. So it will be the continent that, also from a business perspective, will be very interesting, I think, in the future. To your question on misconceptions in Africa, I think it depends a bit on whom you ask, right? I think if you ask the general population, there is like preconceived notions of poverty, of starvation, of conflict. And I think this is only like a partial truth. This is not happening in parts of the continent, so that still exists. But I think this is really only a very selective view, a snapshot of what is actually going on the continent, right? So there's many regions, many countries where we actually do have booming economies, where we do have innovation going on, where we do have lots of opportunities, and actually where there's actually a lot of scope to draw a more positive narrative about what's going on the continent. And you mentioned, for example, East Africa having an average growth rate of between 6 and 7%, right? So this is pretty substantial, right? And I think there's much more about Africa than just these negative laden aspects, which are only partially true. But yeah, we can delve into some of them over the course of the conversation.
You mentioned, of course, that if you start from a lower base, a relatively elevated percentage-wise growth is easier to achieve than when you've reached a certain level. That being said, can you disentangle what is driving this growth?
Yes.
Is it commodities? Is it services? You said manufacturing, but just a little bit. Is it too diverse country by country, or are there certain drivers that one can determine?
There's certainly regional differences, and even within region, country-specific differences. And maybe just before I go into the different factors underlying growth in these different regions, let me maybe just back up the extent to which there are still differences in living standards between Africa and, let's say, industrialized countries like Germany. Germany alone has a larger economy than all of Africa. This is like it's an astonishing fact, right? One has to keep that at the back of your mind when considering also business relationships, and especially Germany specifically, since the composition of the German economy is of a specific way, such that trade with other countries is more amenable. It's more likely to occur because of the kinds of products that German firms on average produce. But I think this is an important fact to mention from the outset in order to frame this conversation. To answer your specific question on the drivers of growth, I think in general, what is true for almost all of Africa is that growth is not driven by manufacturing, right? So there's a few examples. Obviously, we have South Africa, which, because of its history, has, of course, deep economic relationships with many manufacturing firms. Many of the German OEMs, for example, like Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes, they have production bases there. Then more recently, let's say over the last 10 years, also, we have some of the North African countries like Morocco and in Tunisia even a bit longer, but especially Morocco integrating into these automotive supply chains. On the one hand, we have big OEMs shifting part of their production there from Eastern Europe, but also supplier firms actually who produce components for the automotive sector in Morocco and Tunisia specifically. But overall, this is an exception in Africa. And most of the economy and most of the growth is driven by other industries. And here, it really depends on the country under consideration. For example, in Eastern Africa, many of the economies like Ethiopia, for example, and Kenya, they're mostly based on agricultural outputs, right? So the key export product of Ethiopia is coffee, for example, and seed oils are like the second or third one, and cut flowers. Most important export products in Kenya, it is tea and also cut flowers. Then in other countries, like in Western Africa, we also have agricultural products, but of a different kind. So for example, cocoa is a pretty important one for Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. Then we have a whole set of countries that are more based on minerals, right? So we have a few gold exporting countries, for example. Also Ghana, for example, is an important gold exporter. I think also Zambia has quite some, now also Ethiopia actually very recently. And then in the Sahel, a few countries export gold. And then, of course, we have the set of countries that export primarily hydrocarbons, right? So here we have Libya, we have Nigeria, we have Angola. So they are mostly based on fossil fuel exports and often actually raw and not processed. And I think this is an aspect that we can also delve into.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because you as an economist are probably thinking about this as well. Would you say, is it possible for Africa to make the next steps of its economic development if it relies, or if it continues to rely to a significant part on the export of raw commodities? Is that possible? Also comparing it to other regions, for example, I know that Latin America, they have a very similar issue, and they've been trying, some countries more successfully, others less so, for decades basically, to move up the value chain, to at least do some refinement and processing of the raw materials before they get exported. Is that also the way that Africa must go if it wants to continue to develop?
Yeah, I think this is a very big question in the field of development economics, and I think one of the most important one. So what can a growth model be for the African continent, given where we are with the global economy? And maybe just before I answer your question, just to set the framework, because what I left out from my previous answer was that, of course, on the one hand, we have the external sector, right, the exports, but then, and which can drive growth. But then obviously it is important to consider what's actually going on in the countries. And another major trend, which also relates to the population boom, is urbanization. And so almost all countries in Africa, there has been a significant urbanization where people working in agriculture have moved to the cities and worked there. And here, I will shortly get to your question. But the type of, often this is called the reallocation of labor across sectors. In economics jargon is often called structural transformation. And the structural transformation that has been going on in Africa has been of a specific special kind. So because historically in many of the tiger countries, for example, in Asia, if you think about, for example, South Korea, if you think about Taiwan, if you think about Singapore, many of these countries didn't look all that different from African countries, let's say in the 60s or 70s. They also had economies that were mostly reliant on, or the majority of the population was employed in agriculture, right? 50, 60, 70%. They also had an urbanization. But what happened for them is that most of these people leaving agriculture went to the cities as well, but they found jobs in export-oriented manufacturing sectors. And in Africa, by comparison, for the most part, that shift of labor has happened into services, informal services. So speaking of, for example, if you go to an African country, you will see that right away, right? Like informal, small-scale retail and personal services. And these are not very productive economic activities. Still, those also, to the question before, this also drove growth somewhat, since these activities are still, on average, more productive than agriculture. But they are not as productive as export-oriented manufacturing activities, right? And so the question is a bit, given that we didn't see so far, we haven't really seen this migration or this relocation of labor into these export-oriented sectors, is this type of structural transformation that we see in Africa actually sustainable? Or does it require many African countries to become more involved in processing of the resources that they have, which relates to the question that you had, right? And me personally, I think this is necessary. I think historically speaking, if we look at the experience of other countries, or I think except maybe for a few small countries that were focusing just on trading and maybe like professional services, almost all countries that are today industrialized went through a phase of industrialization. And especially more recently, if we think about these Asian countries, also very recently, like China and also Vietnam, for example, they have for a large part grown because of their integration into manufacturing global supply chains. And so I think this will be an important component. I don't say that there cannot be other important sectors like professional services, right? If you make them more productive on the African continent. But I think export-oriented manufacturing will be one of the key components. And up to, the endowment of African countries, I mean, there's a lot that African countries have on offer, right? So as I mentioned earlier, we have minerals, agricultural products, hydrocarbons, which are at the moment, for the most part, exported raw without much local processing going on before. And there's business reasons for that it's not so competitive at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think that will be important for the future.
The Asian tigers that you mentioned, as far as I know, when they industrialized, they went first into what might be called light manufacturing, so relatively easy textiles, certain kind of easier electronics assemblies and stuff like that, rather than heavy industries, which requires a lot of investment. Is that a possibility that you see, that given also the fact that some of those Asian countries are now not that cheap anymore, that some of those production capabilities of production lines will move to Africa?
I think there's an opportunity. And I think for a few countries, you can actually already see that. I think it is not easy, right? So I think things have changed since these countries did it 50 years ago. So during the 60s, 70s, 80s, for example, when or also a bit later, when China in the 90s and early 2000s started integrating into global supply chains, the global economy, the structure of it was a bit different than it is today, right? Today, global trade is dominated by global value chains, right? So every product that we have consists of components from dozens of countries, right? And so each country or firms in these countries specialize on specific products, right? And so over the last 30 years or so, we had this increase or this boom of global value chains, and with that, hyper efficiency. Right. So we now do have like specialized supplier firms in, for example, Asian countries who are very good at what they do. So, I mean, when these countries integrate in global supply chains, what mostly happened was that Western countries like Germany or like from the EU or also the US, they outsourced some of their production, right? And these Asian countries had the advantage of cheap labor, quote unquote. And that was their main competitive advantage. And maybe this is an advantage that African countries have now, since, as you say, wages have been rising in Asian countries. But still, I think cheap labor is one thing, but I think you need more than just cheap labor to attract firms to produce in your country, especially given, and this is another thing that has changed over the last few decades, automation has increased a lot, right? So that's actually also what the research on development economics shows, is that today, many of these export-oriented industries require less labor and more capital investment. And that obviously makes it more difficult for developing economies to get a foot in these sectors. I think it's still feasible, it's still possible, but I think you have to do many things right to convince. I mean, because at the end of the day, it's about convincing, because often it's foreign firms who start, right? That's how most of these Asian countries developed. They attracted foreign investment to their country, who then employed a huge workforce for simple activities, assembly activities. This could be in apparel and electronics and footwear and in these types of light manufacturing sectors. But then in the medium to long term, then a very important component, what many of these successful countries went through, was a period of learning from the foreign firms. Like domestic firms learned from the foreign firms, innovated, and then themselves became important players in the value chains, right? And then an ecosystem around these foreign firms emerged, right? And so I think it's feasible, but it's difficult. I mean, there are some countries that actually try that. Ethiopia is often showcased as an African country that has made steps in the right direction with its apparel assembly sector that started more or less 10 years ago, which has made, initial successes actually with, Ethiopia didn't have an apparel export sector in the early 2010s, or very, very minor one. But through the attraction of foreign firms, especially from Asian countries, who then produced in Ethiopia for the American export market, actually, Ethiopia managed to increase its exports to, let's say, around 200 million or so, right? This is still comparatively small, even within Ethiopia's export basket, compared to coffee, which, like that in 2025 was around 3 billion.
Yeah.
So it's still initial steps. I mean, I think there is signs that it's feasible. Also very recently, actually, that they onshored solar panel manufacturing in Ethiopia, which I found very interesting when I heard about that, when I recently visited the country. So I think it is feasible, but I think it demands like a dedicated effort and many things to go right in the same. So it's not a Selbstgänger, we would say in German. It's not,
it's
exactly. Not easy. Yeah.
So I mean, we talked about the population growth, and that can be a blessing, but also in a certain way a curse, because on the positive side, you have a lot of young people who are able and willing to work. So unlike many of the European countries, there's no shortage of the workforce. On the other hand, of course, it creates a lot of pressure for those countries to provide enough jobs for stability. I guess. It's never a good idea to have too many young people in your society unemployed. That is always a sign of potential trouble that may appear or destabilization.
Yeah, and maybe just to intervene there, like it's not only unemployment, it's also underemployment. Because as I mentioned before, if you look at just the unemployment figures in many of these countries, it's actually, I mean, it depends. Also, especially youth unemployment may be higher, right? But I think the most important feature is that much of that employment is in these informal services, and it's more like underemployment or unproductive employment, where you don't have like a formal job where you earn like a wage income, where you don't pay social security, you're not covered by social security. So that's so even if there's not like unemployment, like the structure of this informal employment still poses an issue.
Now, if we imagine, say, a mid-sized European company that is considering entering the African market, what would you say? What are maybe the 3 most common misperceptions or things that are underestimated when it comes to that?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, because 2 years ago or so, we actually did, our research institute, we did a survey with German firms who either invest in Africa or have like significant exports to the African continent. And when you speak to especially medium-sized, I mean, because I think it depends a lot on whether you're talking about like multinational firms or like, or medium-sized firms or even smaller firms. But I think especially in terms of medium-sized firms, so let's say those that range like 500 people or something like that, right? I think what I heard from many of them when I spoke with them is that the perception of risk, this is like one factor, that often there was like a perceived very high risk in these countries that would be difficult to do business. Where in hindsight, often, I mean, after they made the decision, maybe this is also kind of a selection bias because I only spoke to those that then in the end were successful, right? But often I found it interesting that because especially medium-sized businesses, you don't have like shareholders, and maybe you don't have like, I wouldn't say professional decision making, but it's more like, you have one owner, right, who makes the decision, or a few key people who make the decision. And so it's much more about the perception and probably less about the actual data. And here, like the narrative, I think was probably very detrimental, like in many cases that, there's this high perception of risk.
Risk related to bad governance or, legal systems not working?
Mostly that, right? Corruption, for example, but not necessarily only corruption, but also that it's very difficult to get, for example, a new endeavor off the ground with all the licenses that are being...
So those companies that you spoke to, did they opt for having a local partner then, some kind of a joint venture, or how do these market entries usually work?
I think it depends on the sector, right? So in some sectors and also on the country, because in some countries, I don't know that on the top of my head now for which countries this is the case, but I mean, China is well known for that, right? That they always required Western firms to form joint ventures if they want to invest locally. And there's some African countries or certain sectors where this is also the case. You do have that partially, that they form joint ventures, but some of them, I think this is a big advantage actually of Germany specifically, that Germany actually does have quite extensive network of professionals like the AHKs, the Chambers of Commerce in the partner countries, and also the business scouts, and the Wirtschaftsnetzwerk Afrika, the Germany Trade and Invest. So I think there's a lot of structures that give very good advice to German firms. I mean, I know the German space much better than other spaces, but also with the GIZ, of course, they are more focused on, also partially on business, but more on development cooperation. But I think that's also what we heard from many, that these networks, they were very helpful for finding partners, for example, for finding appropriate locations, suppliers, and so forth.
Yeah. So far, we have talked a lot about what Africa could learn from other examples, East Asia, for example, those countries that emerged before the Asian tigers. But there are probably also things that we can learn, or other parts of the world can learn from Africa. And I would like to talk a little bit about the tech and startup sector, which probably many of our listeners don't know that it exists, but it does. And it has, in fact, I think Africa become one of the fastest growing tech ecosystems in the world in fields such as finance, fintech, health tech, e-commerce, mobile money, of course. I think many people know that. It was basically invented, I believe, in Kenya. M-Pesa, what was it, like 15, 20 years ago? Yeah. Was one of the first very easy mobile payment options long before those things existed in many countries of the global north. So that has continued. There is an emergent tech sector, and I know that you also do research on that.
Yes.
So when you look at that, first of all, maybe describe what's going on there,
Yes.
and then I would be interested in how does that sector differ from tech sectors, say, in the US or in India or in other countries?
Yes. Yeah. I think this is like something which, as you say, many people don't have on their radar. I mean, people who know the continent well probably do, but the general public often doesn't, which is that over the last 10 years, especially, a tech sector has emerged on the African continent. And maybe just to back up a bit what I mean when I talk about tech sector, because earlier I mentioned we have this migration from agriculture to services. And so you do see a lot of entrepreneurship there because many of these individuals work own account firms, self-employed. They're self-employed in the services sector, but they are often entrepreneurs out of necessity. But when we talk about the tech sector, we talk about a different type of development. So professional businesses that heavily draw on different technologies. Now, of course, everyone is talking about AI, but actually the tech sector emerged a bit before like the ChatGPT moment. And firms that use technology in order to scale their businesses, right? So here we're talking about the startup, like professional startups. And this sector has started emerging in the early 2010s. And a good proxy for the prevalence of the tech sector or its magnitude is venture funding, right? So, but venture capitalists, because venture capitalists are investors who invest in risky endeavors, right? So if you look at the data, there's different data sets that also cover Africa, like Crunchbase, for example, and I've done some work using that data set. You can see like since the early 2010s and especially picking up since 2015, the number of venture funding rounds has increased a lot on the African continent. So more and more investments into these tech-enabled firms and sizable investments has taken place. I have to say that comparatively, it's still much less than in developed and industrialized economies, but still it is the fastest growing tech ecosystem in the world, the African one. It is especially concentrated in a few markets, I have to say, right? So there's in each region, there's like one key market. In East Africa, there's Kenya and Nairobi. In Southern Africa, there's South Africa with Cape Town and Johannesburg. In particular, in West Africa, there's Nigeria and Lagos. And in North Africa, there's Egypt and Cairo. These ecosystems have attracted most of the tech investments. And maybe to your question, so how they are different maybe from what we see in Germany, for example, or other Western economies. I think one of the main differences is many of these startups, not all, but many of them, they really try to solve big problems because many of these markets still have big problems. I mean, you mentioned the example of mobile money, right? So that really addressed and partially solved the problem of a huge part of the population still being unbanked, right? And so these are not like marginal things, but they really transform foundational infrastructure of the economy. And so that's what we partially see with some of these startups who do these innovations in areas like fintech, in areas like mobility. And if you, for example, went to Africa, you would see many of these services, a bit like Uber. But I think it's much more important there because it has been much more difficult to get around, also safely, also energy, e-commerce. So these are the types of areas that these startups address.
What I find interesting is this concept or this idea of the leapfrogging.
Exactly.
And I believe we see that with mobile money is that suddenly there is a technology available, mobile payments based on mobile phones that leapfrogs, the traditional banking that we know in the West, where you have a bank account and you have maybe a checkbook or you do money transfers and so on, which is something that most people in Africa never had. So they went straight from, I guess, just cash-based dealings to a mobile payment. And suddenly many countries were more advanced than the countries in the West. So they leapfrog that. Do we also see that in other areas?
Yes. Yeah, I think this is like a very important point and maybe this is also something that maybe we can learn in Germany, learn from Africa, is that many people in Africa, many African countries operate under severe constraints, right? And in order to overcome these constraints, you have to leapfrog. Mobile money is one example, but there's other examples too. So for example, in the energy sector. So many, especially rural areas, are not connected to the grid. And it's not it would cost governments a lot of money to connect them, right? So it would be a huge expense. That's why you see all these investments in decentral electricity provision. There's Mcopa, for example, is a firm that tries to deliver solar panels to remote areas and has like some smart financing solutions to make that actually a good business. Or we also see that with e-commerce, although some of the biggest startups actually had like some economic problems recently, but still we also do see an emergence of internet-based retail. So it's actually skipping big box supermarkets, right, and going right to retail, right? So, and there's a few areas where this is actually going on, which is exciting in my view.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. I think one criticism you said that venture capital is on the rise. So there's much more investment rounds in tech startups or tech companies in Africa. However, I think most of that money still comes from outside of Africa. Mm-hmm. Do you see any chance of that changing, moving to more domestic investment also?
Yeah, this is a good point. For the longest time, most came from outside of Africa. And interestingly, because often, of course, China is often talked about when we speak of Africa, right? And China obviously is very dominant when it comes to infrastructure financing, for example, and also increasingly, extraction projects and also partially manufacturing projects. But when it comes to the tech sector, Western players are actually much more important in financing these startups, right? So over the last decade, it has mostly been, or the majority has been American, actually US-American venture firms. And this comes from the fact that the US capital markets are obviously dominating in the world, right? And especially venture capital in the US is so dominant, but also from others, right? So for Japan, for example, then also partially in Europe, like in the UK, there's investments. Also some of the development finance institutes like KfW and British equivalent, they actually also do investments in these firms. But actually, there has been this shift, not only in Africa, but across the globe when the ZIRP era, the zero interest rate area, ended in 2022 because of the high inflation. When central banks raised interest rates, capital became much more expensive, which is why many of the investors actually withdrew funding from Africa, which is why you could actually see quite a collapse in venture funding in 23, 24. It's now recovering again a bit. But that led, as far as I know, if I got it correct, like the most recent figures, that changed a bit the composition of the funding, right? So while earlier it was mostly Western, especially American venture firms funding these startups, it has now shifted. I think I heard like for 2025, a majority came actually from African investors, right? I think it takes time for that to happen because how that usually happens in the startup ecosystem is that you have exits. And with exit is considered a success case where a startup either is acquired by another firm, right? And so the founders can exit and they make a profit then from the sale of the business, or you exit if you do like an IPO. These are the liquidity events where the founders and the early employees who have stock options get their money back from their time or from their investment in the startup, and also the early angel investors. But that is so important because often, after these liquidity events, you have, in good cases, like several millionaires all of a sudden, right? Or multimillionaires, the founders and the early employees and the investors. And usually or often what happens is that they reinvest, right? And so it takes a few of these liquidity events for the flywheel to come into effect in a sense. And so that the money is then again, and you had that, there was one famous exit by Paystack. They were bought by Stripe. It's like e-payment processing provider. I think they were bought for 250 million. And many of the early, like the founders cashed out and the early employees, and they reinvested that part of the money into the local ecosystem. And the same happened in the US with PayPal, for example, the PayPal mafia, the famous one with Elon Musk and some of the others who benefited from that, from the PayPal exit, and then reinvested that into other endeavors.
And obviously, I guess eventually the best solution would be that some of those exits also resulted in those companies being bought by other African companies rather than being sold to an American tech behemoth, for example.
Yes, exactly.
Executive briefing. What you should read now.
Executive briefing is one of the fixed segments of our show, and we ask all our guests to bring one or two suggestions on what people might read if they want to know more about the topic that we're discussing here. What is your executive briefing, Tevin?
Yeah, It depends a bit on, because we talked about the diverse range of topics, I think ranging from just like general economic conditions in Africa to export-oriented development or service-led growth to the African startup ecosystem. And I have, of course, different sources that I would point the audience to for these different themes. But I think, and also different types of formats, right? So books or articles or podcasts, but something to consume quickly, I think. For the audience, I read a very good article by The Economist, actually, from a few weeks ago on, the shift in Africa as aid is drying up. And you see the retreat of aid. But at the same time, you see an increase actually in private investment and also foreign investment and growth, as we discussed earlier, which has a bit the framing of Africa as a continent of opportunities. So I found that very interesting and easily digestible. So I would point the audience to that. I think there's another, for those who are interested in this whole discussion around development through industrialization and especially export-oriented industrialization and manufacturing, there is a very good blog series, and then they package all these different blogs into one report by VoxDev, which is among development economists and development policymakers and practitioners a very important source, because they're researchers. They synthesize research and publish research, cutting-edge research from development economists mostly. And there was this very interesting blog series on that topic that I would point the audience towards if they are interested in this whole issue around export-oriented development.
Yeah, thank you very much for those two recommendations. And I agree, we covered a lot of topics, so you could probably go on and give us more recommendations. As always, we will make sure that we put the links to those recommendations in our show notes, and at least the article that you mentioned in The Economist, I saw that as well. I found it very interesting. I definitely recommend that. And as always, Economist articles are easy to read. They're usually well researched. So that's definitely something that I would also recommend. I would like to talk a little bit more about geopolitics, because that is also a little bit the area that we focus on in this podcast, where we look at the nexus between international relations, geopolitics, and business. Now, we mentioned that some companies may not be paying enough attention right now when it comes to the opportunities that Africa or African countries offer. When it comes to the political sphere, I think it's relatively clear that all of the major powers in the regions of the world, whether it's the North Americans, the Europeans, also the Asians, primarily the Chinese, of course, also the Indians increasingly, they're all trying to court Africa and African countries, trying to gain influence, maintain influence politically, economically. Is that a good thing for Africans, because they have a lot of competition for their attention, and if they do it savvily, they can kind of play off the different interests against each other and benefit from that?
Yeah, I think you have to be savvy. Yeah, I think there can be an opportunity, but there's obviously also risks, right? So, I mean, it also has been shown, to go back to economics. I mean, now geoeconomics and geopolitics, they intertwine very deeply and closely, but there has been this research, recent research from the IMF, Gopinath and others, who have actually shown that you can already see in trade and investment flows fragmentation of the global economy, whereby, as I mentioned earlier, during this long period of increased efficiency and the expansion of global value chains, every country traded with every country, but this is now changing a bit, right? So obviously China and the US, since the first Trump administration, there were actually some tariffs being levied against Chinese imports. And now obviously under the second Trump administration, especially towards China, but towards the whole world in a sense, the US has raised tariffs. But so what the researchers show is that you actually see especially two groups in a sense, one centered a bit around China and the other one around the US. Still, there's trade going on, but actually, if you look at US-China trade, it has decreased quite a lot over the last few years. So there is actually an opportunity for countries to connect these two increasingly separate blocks. Let's say the Western bloc and the Eastern bloc, to simplify. And for example, countries like Vietnam and Mexico, they have actually benefited quite a lot from that, since many of the Chinese firms, they have relocated to Vietnam and Mexico to produce there and then export from there to the US market, right? And something similar could be envisaged when it comes to, for many African countries, there's an opportunity there. And the story with Ethiopia and the solar panels that I mentioned earlier is actually such a story, since Vietnam actually was the country that benefited most from China being hit. So the solar panel manufacturing sector increased quite a lot in Vietnam. But now Vietnam was hit because most of that is exported to the US. And the US said, oh, no, these are Chinese firms. They're subsidized. You get a high tariff too. And now they relocated to Ethiopia, right? And so
okay. Well, the question is, is that a sustainable model?
That's an important question. So I think there's no way around gaining a true competitive advantage, and increased local processing. And I think this is maybe the value proposition that the Europeans could bring in, right? So it's a bit about like the resources, right? Like the critical minerals, especially.
Yeah.
And I think for both sides, for Europe's mineral security, it's very important, obviously, to have stake in there and have partnerships. But also from an African perspective, local processing is very important. And I think European firms, especially German firms, are very well equipped there, since German firms specifically have like an expertise, obviously, in the manufacturing sector. So, I mean, it's happening, right? I think there's a lot of competition now for Africa, especially for the minerals. And I think the EU has its own, like the Global Gateway, its own kind of strategic document or strategic approach and its response to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative in Africa to counter them, actually. And I think it's important for also European countries maybe to band together to assert themselves. And
well, that's always the problem that we have, that we not always manage to do that here in Europe. You said, yes, there is free trade is retrenching. I guess, people say that the era of multilateralism is over. There's increasingly camps again being forced that compete with each other. Do you have the impression that African countries are being forced to decide which camp they want to belong to? So you're either with us or you're with the others? Yeah,
I think it's difficult, obviously, to force someone, right? And especially if you want something from someone. If you don't have leverage, then, the US has a lot of leverage against many countries because they have been, for the past few decades, like the major importer, And so if the US as an export market breaks away, that's very harmful for many countries, right? And then obviously, like in terms of security, and of course they also have leverage, like specifically against Europe, for example. But like if we think about Africa, I think obviously they try, right, to bind African countries into their sphere. But what one can see on the ground is that many countries actually are pursuing like a multi-alignment or multi-partnership kind of approach, right? So we could talk about specific countries, but many of these countries that we have discussed, actually, they are forging partnerships with Western firms as well as Eastern, like China, for example, right? So, and I mean, I can understand that, right? Because they try to do like the best out of their situation and, take advantage also of that. And I mean, in some sense, it's a good right. And so that's why I think it's so important to have a good value proposition for what we can actually offer.
Absolutely. Tevin, we've already come almost to the end of our episode.
A bold prediction. The world in 10 years.
We always ask our guests to bring their crystal ball and to look into the future and tell us how the world or the subject that we've been discussing will look like in 10 years. So when we talk about Africa, Africa's economic opportunities, where do you think we will stand, or African countries, African societies will stand in 10 years from now?
I think it will be very diverse, right? I mean, you can already see it. You have countries with large growth rates, like Ethiopia, for example, 7%, in the East African countries and more generally, but also other countries. But then you also have countries that are conflict-ridden, right? And for example, in the Sahel, Sudan, but also Ethiopia actually has like internally, they had a civil war and there's like quite a lot of tensions. So I think it's difficult to speak of Africa as a whole. Maybe the AFCFTA, the Free African Free Continental Trade Area, will change some of that. We haven't discussed that, but I think there will be big differences across countries. But I do think that for some countries, we will see actually, and there's like early signs also in terms of reforms that are taking place in some of the countries. In my opinion, reforms towards the right direction, like more liberalization, giving more space for private firms, making business easier. And then, of course, paired with the endowments that many countries have in terms of minerals, or also renewable energy. We didn't talk about that either. There's huge potential, right? And I think there will be some countries who will grow quite a lot in the next 10 years and who will position themselves as key players in global energy or minerals, maybe manufacturing supply chains, and who will be key in the global economy. Obviously, it's very difficult to say who it will be and how many. There's so many of these black swan events these days, right, where you can't really tell, right? Well, everything could change.
Absolutely.
Any moment now. But I think there's a chance that this will happen.
Very good. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, both in terms of geographical scope, but also in terms of topics. And as you rightly pointed out, there are vast differences. Africa is not one homogeneous area. It is many countries with all sorts of different opportunities, but also different problems. So we were probably not able to do each and one of them justice in our conversation. We didn't manage to talk about all the topics you said, some that would have been very interesting also to discuss. What I believe is important, and that would be at least my takeaway for our listeners, is that by and large, Africa today is a very interesting economic opportunity for international companies to invest in, also as a market, of course, as a consumer market. And it is not, at least to a large extent, the basket case that maybe it used to be in the past, or at least the way people tended to see it from the perspective of the global north. And that is, I think, good news. That makes it a very interesting and dynamic area. So we should definitely continue our conversation at some point and see, where those different strengths that we've been discussing here have been going. Thank you very much, Tevin, for being our guest today in this very, very interesting episode.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.
This was another episode of the Business Diplomacy Today podcast. This podcast is presented by the German Maritime Center. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, we would also be delighted if you would leave a review or a rating there. You can also go to our website at businessdiplomacy.today to check out the show notes of this episode. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.